What Patton found in the camp, within a camp where prisoners were sent to die, slowly April 1945. A sub-camp punishment barracks near Buchenwald, Germany. Rain falls on raw earth. American soldiers stand outside a wooden building that is isolated by a second, interior barbed wire fence. This is a camp within a camp. Inside the structure, 26 emaciated men sit or lie on a bare concrete floor, staring through hollow eye sockets. They are the only ones left alive out of dozens who entered. The air inside smells of damp stone, unwashed skin, and old grease. A German officer in a clean gray uniform stands near the doorway, holding a thick leather ledger under his arm. He glances at his watch and demands that the Americans clear the room immediately. He insists that these men are dangerous subversives who require strict isolation. But General George Patton is already on his way to this compound, and he is about to turn this hidden concrete tomb into a courtroom of direct physical reckoning. This is the story of what Patton found in the camp, within a camp where prisoners were sent to die slowly. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show the evidence no order could erase. Professor Adam Kowalski was 48 years old, an academic from the ruined city of Warsaw, and a prisoner who had survived 4 months inside the isolation block. Before the war tore his life apart, he taught literature and history to classrooms of young Poles. When the occupation forces closed the universities, he refused to stop. He moved his classes into cold basements, teaching by candlelight, risking his life for the preservation of knowledge. The secret police eventually found him during a midnight raid. They sent him to the camps to be erased, but he brought his razor-sharp intellect with him into the wire. In the punishment barracks, where men died around him every single day, he forced himself to stay awake during the freezing nights. He committed every name, every date of birth, and every final gasp to his memory. He became a living archives, a breathing record of the fallen, because he knew that if he died, their existence would be completely wiped from the earth. SS Hauptscharführer Otto Wirth was 33 years old, a committed party fanatic from the city of Magdeburg, and the absolute ruler of the internal punishment compound. He viewed the prisoners not as men, but as biological waste that required systematic elimination. He frequently told his subordinates that the punishment barracks was not a prison, but a process, and that the process only ended when the prisoner did. While the men under his control froze on bare stone, Wirth walked the muddy paths in custom-tailored leather boots that never showed a speck of dirt. He wore a crisp, pressed uniform and kept a silver-plated skull insignia pinned to his cap. He spent his afternoons in a heated office, drinking imported brandy and meticulously updating a leather-bound journal. In this book, he recorded what he called disciplinary outcomes, ensuring that every single name concluded with the word deceased. He brought this same icy, bureaucratic cruelty to the camp entrance on the morning the American vanguard arrived at the outer gates. By the spring of 1945, the entire Western Front was moving at a breathless, frantic pace. The German army was collapsing inward, retreating toward the heart of the fatherland as Allied armored divisions shattered their defensive lines day after day. Tank columns raced down the autobahns, bypassing major cities to trap entire field armies in massive pockets. In the chaos of this final retreat, the vast network of labor camps and forced concentration facilities began to fracture. Supply lines completely broke down. Food shipments to the camps stopped entirely, and the water systems failed. The Nazi state was losing its grip on its civilian infrastructure. Yet the camp administrators refused to abandon their duties. Instead, they doubled down on their internal security measures, growing increasingly desperate as the sound of distant artillery grew louder each morning. In this climate of absolute collapse, many frontline tactical officers simply drove past the secondary camps. They were focused entirely on maintaining their operational momentum, chasing down retreating combat units, and securing vital river crossings before the bridges could be blown. The sheer scale of the humanitarian disaster was too vast for the advanced guards to process, and many commanders chose to leave the isolated compounds for the follow-up rear guard elements to handle. This allowed local camp authorities to maintain their private empires of terror for several extra days, operating entirely outside the laws of civilized warfare. They destroyed files, burned registration lists, and buried evidence in shallow pits behind the barracks. They assumed that the advancing Americans would be too busy fighting a war to notice a single isolated block hidden behind a secondary fence line. They expected the chaos of the German collapse to hide their final, desperate crimes from the eyes of the world. But that calculation failed completely when the vanguard units pulled up to this specific compound. An American medical officer, Captain James Vance, walked through the interior gate of the punishment compound with two combat medics. He found Otto Worth standing outside the wooden barracks, holding his leather ledger. Vance told the German officer that his men were taking control of the building immediately to provide emergency rations and plasma to the survivors. Worth did not move from the doorway. He adjusted his peaked cap and told the captain that entry was strictly forbidden by martial decree. Vance stepped closer, pointing to the red cross on his helmet, and said that the war was over for this camp, and the medical team had direct orders to clear every structure. Worth smiled thinly and replied that these men were not standard labor prisoners, but violent political subversives who had forfeited their right to state care. The captain looked past Worth's shoulder into the dark room, seeing the skeletal figures on the concrete, and told the German that these men were visibly starving to death. Worth shrugged his shoulders and stated that the prisoners were merely experiencing the natural result of their own insubordination against the Reich. Vance took out his sidearm, held it at his side, and ordered the commander to step away from the entrance before his medics removed him by force. Worth did not flinch, pointing at his clean uniform and his rank insignia, and said that an American captain had no legal authority to alter the disciplinary sentences of the SS. He insisted that the camp rules required these men to remain isolated until their process was fully concluded. He stated that the subhumans inside did not deserve American medicine because they had spent months actively resisting the new European order. Vance realized the absolute scale of the fanaticism standing in front of him. He knew that this went far beyond a standard military dispute over property or prisoners. He turned to his sergeant, told him to hold the perimeter exactly where it was, and ordered his driver to bring a radio jeep to the inner gate immediately. The captain reported the exact conditions of the punishment barracks up the chain of command, describing the double fence, the concrete floor, and the unyielding attitude of the camp commander. The report reached Patton within the hour. Patton's jeep pulled up to the gate, 4 stars on his helmet, ivory revolvers on his belt. The general walked into the inner compound unannounced, his presence instantly freezing every movement in the muddy courtyard. The combat medics stood at attention, and the German guards backed away from the secondary fence line. Patton looked at the 26 men huddled on the freezing floor, then turned his gaze to the immaculate uniform of the camp commander. His voice was quiet, but it carried across the silent stone barracks. Patton asked who was in direct charge of this specific building. Worth stepped forward, clicked his heels together, and stated his name and rank, claiming he managed the Special Disciplinary Detachment for political subversives. Patton looked at the concrete floor and asked why there was no straw, no blankets, and no bedding for the men inside. Worth replied that the regulations for punishment prisoners strictly forbade comfort items to ensure proper compliance with camp rules. Patton pointed to the survivors and asked how many men had entered this building over the last 6 months. Worth opened his book and proudly stated that 80 names had been registered in the log and that 54 had successfully completed their process. "You believe you are an administrator of law," Patton said. "You stand here in your polished leather boots and your tailored wool coat, looking at men who have been reduced to skin and bone, and you call it a process. You tell my officers that these men are subhumans because they refuse to break, because they taught forbidden classes, and because they chose to remain human in the middle of your wire. You believe your rank and your ledger protect you from the reality of what you have done. But you are entirely wrong," Patton continued. Your process ends today, and the law that covers this ground is no longer yours. A man from Warsaw sits on that concrete right now, keeping a record of every name you tried to erase, and his memory is the evidence your fire could not touch. You have two options before you. You will either drop that book and personally carry every single survivor out to the medical ambulances on your own back, or my engineers will strip that uniform from your body and lock you inside this exact room without food or water until your own process is finished. Pick one in the next 10 seconds. Worth stared at the ivory handles of the general's sidearms, his face turning entirely white as his hands began to shake against the leather ledger. He slowly dropped the book into the mud at Patton's feet and bowed his head in silent compliance. Captain Vance stepped forward and seized the heavy leather ledger from the muddy ground, holding it open as a mobile writing desk. Two armed infantrymen stepped up behind Otto Worth, their bayonets fixed, forcing the German commander toward the narrow wooden doorway of the punishment barracks. Worth shifted his weight, his polished boots slipping slightly on the slick clay as he approached the first skeletal survivor. He bent down, took the frail Polish professor by the shoulders, and hoisted the man's weight onto his back. The camp commander gasped under the sudden burden, his face turning dark crimson as the heavy wool of his tailored coat rubbed against the prisoner's ragged uniform. Patton stood perfectly still near the interior fence, his hands resting lightly on his ivory-handled revolvers, watching the entire spectacle without a single trace of emotion. The surrounding American soldiers watched in absolute silence as the former ruler of the compound stumbled toward the waiting field ambulances, his breath coming in ragged, painful wheezes. The 26 survivors looked on from their stretchers with hollow eyes, witnessing the precise physical reversal of their months of isolation. Worth made 4 separate trips back and forth across the muddy yard, his uniform soaked with sweat and rain, completely stripped of his absolute authority in front of his former captives. Professor Adam Kowalski spent several months in an Allied military hospital before returning to Warsaw to help rebuild the university. He resumed his academic work in the winter of 1946, teaching history to a new generation of students in classrooms that finally had glass in the windows. He refused to discuss the camp with his colleagues, but he kept a handwritten notebook containing all 54 names locked in his desk drawer until his death in 1974. Otto Worth was captured by military police 3 days after the camp was cleared, while attempting to cross the Elbe River in civilian clothes. He stood trial before an American military tribunal in Nuremberg during the summer of 1946, where the transcribed testimony of the Polish professor was read directly into the court record. The leather ledger he had dropped in the mud was presented as prosecution exhibit number 12. He was sentenced to life imprisonment and served 20 years in a secured military prison before being released to live quietly in his hometown, where he died in obscurity in 1982. General Patton never mentioned the hidden compound in his public briefings or his official victory reports to the War Department. He recorded the incident only once, writing 3 short sentences in his private diary on the night of the discovery. He noted that some men are built to survive anything because they possess a purpose that steel and stone cannot break. Some historians have argued that Patton's direct physical intervention inside the subcamp overstepped the boundaries of standard military protocol. They suggest that a field commander should have focused strictly on the movement of frontline armored columns rather than micromanaging the civilian evacuations or enforcing immediate personal punishments on local administrative personnel. Others have argued the opposite, maintaining that the extreme breakdown of moral law across the region required a swift, unmistakable demonstration of authority to prevent the further destruction of vital criminal evidence. What is certain is that the absolute precision of the recorded names and dates preserved inside the compound provided the foundation for subsequent prosecutions. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same? Or would you have left the punishment barracks commander for the formal military courts to handle? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about the evidence no order could erase, make sure to subscribe.